Shalom, this is Rabbi Michael Panitz. I'm the rabbi of Temple Israel of Norfolk, Virginia. This is the pulpit of our congregation. I'm honored to be speaking to you from it. At this time, I'm going to give you the second half of a two-part message. The first one is available online, and it's called A Biblical Puzzle: Jacob to Israel, to Jacob, to Israel, to Jacob. Last week we began examining an interesting biblical puzzle. The Bible tells us that God changed Jacob's name to Israel, saying, quote, "Not Jacob shall your name hence be said, but Israel." Genesis 32, verse 29. But then the Bible continues to refer to the patriarch by the name Jacob. What is the reason for that apparently self-contradictory usage? We saw last week that the traditional answers do not resolve more problems than they raise. Let us then look for another answer. You may recall that I mentioned last week that Genesis has not one, but two accounts of the name change. The angel wrestling story is the more famous of the two. It's probably what you remember from Sunday school. It is the first one. But 3 chapters later, chapter 35, the Bible recounts that God appeared to Jacob when the patriarch returned from, quote, Padan Aram, a place name, and changed Jacob's name at that time. And here's the quote, Genesis chapter 35, verse 10. "Your name, Jacob, no longer shall your name be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name." Let us note at the outset that the traditional harmonization of this account in Genesis 35 with the earlier one in Genesis 32 does not work well. Traditionally, it is said that this is a reconfirmation of the name change. In other words, that this account takes place where the actors know about the previous one. The plain language of the text militates against this interpretation. In this passage, God identifies the current name of the patriarch as Jacob, not Israel in ideal reality yet thwarted by circumstance or any other attempted squaring of the circle. He's Jacob, 3 chapters after the name was changed. Much more convincing is the observation that what we have in chapter 35 and chapter 32 is 2 versions of the common memory of an important event in the early history of our nation. Who were the custodians of these 2 versions? In this case, the earlier narrative, the angel wrestling narrative, itself is a fusion of 2 accounts of Jacob crossing back from Aram to Canaan. Scholars call the 2 accounts J for its use of the specific name of God here, similar to the name in the Protestant translations Jehovah, J, and, quote, E for its preference for the generic term El or Elohim, just meaning God. We know from the book of Exodus, chapter 6, verses 1 through 3, that according to the E Elohim source, God was known to Jacob only as Elohim, and revealed the special name Yud He Vav He only to Moses. And here's the quote. God spoke to Moses and said to him, "I am the Lord," meaning I am Yud He Vav He, I am Jehovah. "I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as El Shaddai," that's the name of God. "But my name Yud He Vav He, in that name I was not known to them." The account of Genesis 32, therefore, is the work of 2 strands of evolving biblical tradition, likely to have been fused and stabilized by the 8th century, before the Common Era, the middle of the First Temple era. On the other hand, the account in chapter 35 has special terms, such as the geographical term Padan Aram, specifically connected to another strand of the evolving biblical tradition, the strand that we call priestly, P for short. Scholars use that name, priestly, because the account contains lengthy passages of particular interest to priestly authors, such as the details of the sacrificial rituals and the architecture of the tabernacle. But the priestly source contains important narratives, such as the first creation story in Genesis. And it also has at least a few notices about the patriarchs, including this notice of the name change from Jacob to Israel. This different approach to reading the Bible allows for an easy understanding of the distribution of the names Jacob and Israel in the balance of the book of Genesis. References to Jacob correlate to the source that we call E. That is simply explained because the E Elohim source does not contain any tradition of Jacob's name being changed, as my quote from Exodus chapter 6 just confirms. The passages that do contain the name Israel are mostly from the J, Jehovah, source, and generally they can be identified as that source by other characteristic vocabulary. Now, this solution is not without some difficulties. We can identify some passages as having the characteristics of a priestly source, and yet, anomalously, the name Jacob rather than Israel. This is a problem, because the priestly source is confidently identified with the name change story in chapter 35. But we can explain the names there as a secondary development. The priestly author of those narratives, or if you prefer, the priestly transmitter of those sacred memories, was dealing with an evolving text that already contained the J text narrative of Jacob wrestling with the angel. The priestly author wanted to avoid the theologically problematic notion that the patriarch had successfully wrestled a divine being to a draw, which would be tantamount to a human winning in a contest with divinity, an idea repugnant to the priestly mindset. By avoiding the name Israel in selected passages, that priestly biblical author reduced the potential for offensive thinking about the relationship of humans with God. What do we gain from this approach, analyzing the finished product of the Torah down to its constituent precursors? Well, the most obvious advantage is that we do not have to employ special pleading to harmonize Bible verses that most simply and rationally can be seen as contradicting one another. Faith and reason are friends again, not mutually antagonistic alternatives. That is the attitude of much of Judaism, thanking God for the minds we employ to rise up from mere subsistence to the characteristic human relationship with God. I'd like to suggest a second advantage as well. When we see that the Bible is the result of a process of tradition and teaching, a process of theological meditation and application, rather than a finished product dictated from heaven, then we regain a sense of religion as being in relationship with life, developing in the light of historical events. That is the religious truth of our day. Therefore, seeing the Bible as a mirror of our early history helps us feel kinship with our predecessors who contributed to its development. The people of the book, we Jews are called. As a people, we went through good times and bad. Our Bible, the book, reflects that. Ultimately, I see the Bible as a sustained religious meditation on the relationship of our people Israel with our God, with God. That meditation took place in the midst of the life of our people, not only when we stood at Sinai to receive the covenant, but in all the centuries of the biblical era. Seeing the Bible as a living and growing text in its day will help us to turn to it for guidance in dealing with the issues of our own. Jacob to Israel and back to Jacob, That is our story as well. We have more than one voice in our tradition. Let us develop the wisdom to hear the various voices and to weigh them with one eye on their heavenly source and the other eye on the lives we're living here and now. Like Jacob's ladder, that famous image, our Torah rests its base on the ground of everyday life, but its top reaches up to heaven. Shalom.